presenter is Eugene Makovec with American Bee Journal. He's the editor of ABJ.
You paused there, but I was afraid you were going to say bee culture.
No, but I'm thinking, you've done so many things. You're Missouri State Beekeeper, Beekeeper of the Year several times. Been president of the Three Rivers Beekeeping for a couple of terms. He's got a lot of credentials and stuff behind him. But I wanted to share with you. This is a book that is very small, and it's a very sweet kind of story about AI Root. So AI Root is one of the oldest equipment manufacturers in the country, and this is kind of the golden age of beekeeping that Eugene's going to talk about. And in this book, I read about AI Root. He had a jewelry business. And one of his employees, he just saw one of his employees out catching a swarm. And he went to his employee and said, "What are you doing? Or what is that?" It's like a swarm of bees. And he's like, "Tell me more about it." He's kind of really intrigued and said, I'll give you $1 or something. I don't know. That's one of the stories. One of the versions of the story is that he offered him $1 if he would catch a swarm for him. Right, so whatever colony swarmed again, brought it in, and he actually put it in the building on the 4th floor of a brick building similar to that, with no windows, and set the box maybe 6 or 8 feet from the window, and the colony collapsed because they just couldn't they couldn't navigate. So then he kind of thought, maybe I should learn how to do this, and he would, on a Friday night, get in his horse-drawn buggy in Medina, Ohio, and drive his horses to Cleveland to buy a beekeeping book. And he would do this weekend after weekend after weekend, and just, he just went crazy, maybe OCD about it, learned about Lorenzo Langstroth and ended up partnering with him because Lorenzo Langstroth is credited with Bee Space, removable frame hive. AI Root kind of perfected the equipment, and he shared the proceeds of the revenue from his equipment, which is kind of awesome. But if you can just imagine, would you be willing to go, get on a horse and buggy and spend an entire weekend driving to another city to buy books on beekeeping if you're trying to learn how to do this? And what we all actually have is the American Bee Journal that every month, shows up in my mailbox with amazing information, and they have really kind of been documenting the history of beekeeping since the mid-1800s. And this is the editor. So I want to welcome Eugene up.
Okay, so thanks for having me, and I'm going to talk about the golden age of beekeeping, which is basically the mid 1800s, about 1850 through the end of that century. First of all, this guy on the left is my dad from about 1950. He would have been about 25 years old at that time.
Wow.
And I crossed that picture several years ago. That was pretty neat. Wow. And this guy should look familiar over here. So, why do we call this the golden age of beekeeping? Well, for really thousands of years prior to that time, we were kind of doing things more or less the same way. People were catching swarms and throwing them in, straw skeps or clay tubes or whatever, and wooden boxes, and they were having to kind of tear everything apart at the end of the season to harvest the honey and the wax, and then they'd start over catching swarms again. In the spring, it was not a very sustainable way of doing things. Well, this kind of middle part of the 19th century just happened to be a time when some very extraordinary individuals came on the scene, were involved in beekeeping, and there was a lot more being written and studied about bees, and there were books being written and articles and things. And these people were doing a lot of research and there were people like Wagner and Langstroth and Moses Quimby, Amos Root. These people all happened on the scene around the same time, and the inventions and the innovations that they came up with just revolutionized the industry in ways that are still with us today. I mean, we're all still running these Langstroth. Langstroth is the modern beehive, and it's 170 years old, so it's a pretty amazing thing. So I'm going to talk about several of these people and their contributions, and then I'm going to kind of give a brief history of American Bee Journal from 1861 to today, and things that were going along with that. So Samuel Wagner was the first editor. He was the founder of the journal. He lived in Philadelphia, which is also where Langstroth lived, and they did a few things, and I didn't really know how intertwined Root and Langstroth were with the hive that Jane was talking about. These two guys worked together on a number of things. To begin with, Langstroth, while he was inventing his hive, he had all these notes and all this research that he was doing, and he had all this stuff that he had just had in a pile. And Samuel Wagner was he was the child of German immigrants. Spoke nothing but German for about the first 8 or 10 years of his life. Well, eventually he got to where he was a teenager. He was learning English, and he became very fluent in both languages. He got into beekeeping. He started ordering books and magazines from the old country and doing some translations of some of these works. And he was starting to translate a book from a German called Jan Sierzone, and he ran across Langstroth. He met with Langstroth, and he saw all this work that Langstroth and he had done, and he said, you know what, rather than me waste my time on this, let's get your works published. And he worked with Langstroth to produce this hive and the honeybee, which is still known today as kind of the Bible of beekeeping. And new editions come out about every 15, 20 years, and it's the go-to book for all the facts on the industry and honeybee biology. So he was the guy that talked Langstroth into doing this. He was one of the first people to import Italian bees to this country. People were still keeping the old German black bees that had been brought over basically by the Jamestown colonists back in the early 1600s. And they weren't the most pleasant bees to work with, and they weren't the most productive. And people were hearing about these golden Italians, and they started bringing them over. He was one of the first to do that. He also paired with Langstroth on a patent, one of the early extractors. I think the extractor was first invented in maybe 1865 or 63, and they came out with, they got a patent on a version of their own. It's kind of known in part, just the brightness of the screen, but it's got this wooden tub on it, which would have made it very heavy. But what's special about it, it was the first gear-driven extractor. When you hear that, you think, well, how else would you do it? Well, there were various things going on, and actually, I think the first extractor, this guy had a thing there where he actually spun around like this. Wow. We've got an old extractor called a Peabody sitting in the American Bee Journal library up at Daydam, which is my office on the couple of days a month that I'm up there. But it kind of sits on the ground. It's on a base, and it's got a round base that it's sitting on, and a spindle that comes up on a bearing, and you put a couple of frames in the basket, and the whole extractor spins around that spindle. There's a little wooden dowel, kind of a dowel thing on the top, and you spin it like this, and that thing spins around, and it spins out, and that goes down to the bottom. There's a tray that collects the honey. So there's a lot of ways to skin a cat, so to speak, but theirs was the first gear-driven one. They got the patent on it, but they wrote in the patent, anyone is free to use this. So Langstroth, of course, is best known for his bee space, and everybody knows what the bee space is. Anybody want me to explain that? Okay, so So he based this on his movable frame beehive on this bee space, and revolutionized, you know, the way people kept bees at the time. He also had the hive and the honeybee. He was importing Italian queens, and where Wagner had pushed him to publish the hive and the honeybee, he in turn pushed Wagner to start an American magazine. He told him, you know, we've got all these books that people are writing, and we've got articles being published in agricultural magazines and scientific magazines, but unlike some of these other countries, France and England and Germany, there is no magazine in America that is dedicated to the science of and practice of apiculture. And I think it's time that we had one. So he helped Wagner and pushed him into starting the American Bee Journal. By the way, this is an early Langstroth hive here that's sitting on a shelf up at Data as well. And he was also from the Philadelphia area. So then we had Moses Quinby, and I just love that name. You know, you introduce yourself as Moses Quinby, people are going to remember you. But he was said to have been the first true commercial beekeeper, and this guy had hundreds of hives. He modified the Langstroth hive into the Quinby hive, kind of sort of violated the patent, but not really, because he wasn't selling them. He was on good terms with Langstroth, but he just designed his own version of it, built a whole bunch of them because he was running a lot of hives, and he had people working for him. And he was known for having shipped produced 22,000 pounds of honey in a single season. That was unheard of. And there was a year where he shipped a boatload of honey up the Hudson River, and A.I. Root at the time said Quinby broke the market by dumping all that honey on the market and just disrupted everything. But what Quinby's best known for is the first smoker with the bellows. And again, you wonder, well, how else would you do it? Right? Well, they had all kinds of ways. You know, you carry a coffee can around with a pot of boiling or burning material. You blow stuff into the entrance. You had various ways that people did. I remember my dad saying once he worked with a beekeeper that the guy just smoked a pipe, and he was always just puffing smoke. But anyway, this guy came along and he developed a smoker with a bellows, and all of our smokers now have bellows, even this thing, whatever that is. That's just the way we do it. And then we had A.I. Root that Jane was talking about. Root was a really special guy. He was into a lot of different things, and he was, in addition to you know, he first started out with that swarm and everything, and you know, got hooked just like we all do. But in addition to being a beekeeper, he became a large-scale beekeeping supplier. He perfected beeswax foundation. By the way, I skipped on this Wagner one. Wagner patented a beeswax foundation process back in 1861. But he didn't do anything with it. He didn't have the wherewithal or the money to make the machinery to produce it, so he kind of sat on it, and some people kind of blamed him for holding this process up because he wasn't using the patent. But of course, it didn't take long before people got around and found their own ways and whatnot. This guy was said to have perfected the beeswax foundation, and he started producing it, and he had the best way of doing it. This is one of his old machines, and you can see here you've got this, you know, it's a pair of rollers, and they've got that intricate design, and it's back to back. You know, if you hold up a sheet of foundation, you've got that hexagon, and then beside it you see, or below it you see the middle of where the other hexagons come together. There's a way that it has to be done, and it's got to be lined up perfectly. And these were, I believe, aluminum rollers here. And as you can imagine, if you do it wrong, you can make a big mess. You can make a mess of the foundation. You can also trash these rollers if they come out of mesh and grind against each other. So this guy figured it out. And in fact, when the Daydance started selling foundation, making and selling foundation in a big way, they actually bought a root machine to make that at first. They still make a ton of that foundation, and the machines, frankly, aren't much newer than these are. They produce a lot of beeswax foundation up at Daydance. So Root was an early writer for American Bee Journal. He had a column called The Novice where he gave advice to beekeepers, and then he started his own magazine in 1873 called Gleanings in Bee Culture, and it was called that up into, I think, into the 1980s before they finally shortened it to Bee Culture. And Kim Flodden told me several years ago that John Root was his boss when he took over, and John decided, you know, nobody knows what that word gleanings means anymore anyway, and it's kind of a clunky name, let's just call it Bee Culture. But the Root Company also sold beekeeping supplies for a century or over a century, up until like the 80s or 90s, when they finally folded up the beekeeping, the actual beekeeping supply business, and just dropped back to the magazine and also candles. The AI Root is a huge candle company. Daydance sells quite a few candles, mostly for the church candle industry, but they sell tons and tons of candles up at the AI Root Company. And for them, the magazine is just this little sliver of their business. So it's all about candles these days. And then Root also came out with the ABC and XYZ of beekeeping, which is kind of their version of the Beekeeper's Bible. It's a simpler thing than Hive and the Honeybee. It's easier to read because it's basically like a dictionary. It's all alphabetical order, ABC to XYZ. You flip it open, you want to look up queen mandibular pheromone, you go to the cues and you read about it. So it's a little bit simpler, but it's the same way where every few years they'll come out with a revised edition about it. And then one of the most interesting things about this, and Jay and I were talking about this before, was he had this fascination with the Wright brothers. The Wright brothers were in Dayton. He was in Medina, Ohio, and it's about, mileage-wise, I'm not sure. It took me 3 hours to drive from one to the other a couple of years ago when I was up there. And you know, this is in modern automobiles and interstate highways. Well, the Wright brothers owned this bike shop, combination bike shop and print shop up down in Dayton, and they also started tinkering with planes, and they made it a plane shop too. They were building parts and doing all this stuff, and they started doing this flight testing and things. And Amos Root heard about what they were doing, and it was just fascinated him. He started corresponding with them, and when they were doing their flight testing, you know, you hear about Kitty Hawk where they made a very short flight at some point, but most of the testing, most of the accomplishments were done in a field in the Dayton area, and he got their permission to drive down there. He drove a 1903 Oldsmobile, which I don't even know what that looked like at that time, but on whatever roads they had at the time, he drove down there and spent weeks watching them do all this flight testing. It was just a handful of people that were privy to what was going on. They allowed him to take notes and write about it, and they swore him to secrecy. They made him sit on the story for, I don't know, 6 months or something like that. He put out a teaser in Bee Culture about it, or in Gleanings about it, but you know, couldn't really, you know, can't really tell you what it is, whatever. But then he ended up writing this article. He sent it to Scientific American, and depending on the story you read, one story, like she said, was that they turned it down. Another story was that they just didn't bother to respond to him. But you had this strange bit of trivia where here was one of the biggest accomplishments in human history that, eventually led to putting a man on the moon, and the first written account of it appeared in this, fairly obscure little magazine at the time called Gleanings in Bee Culture. So, and this was all because of this guy, this Renaissance man, and all of his various interests that decided to get involved in it. So then we had Charles Vedant came along. He immigrated here from France. He had developed an interest in bees in France in a smaller way, and he was unhappy where he was. He had a friend that had moved to Basco, Illinois, which is up near the Hamilton area, and told Charles, hey, you can move up to here, you can move out here, and you can grow grapes. It's a great place to grow grapes for producing wines, and you can keep bees out here, and it's a great place to live. So he moved to America, moved to Hamilton, started growing grapes. That did not work out well for him. Of course, he had the beekeeping bug, which took over his life the way it does for all of us. And he jumped into beekeeping in a big way. He started importing the Italian bees. He was importing Carniolan bees as well. And he started just keeping bees in a big way, large scale. We talked about queen bee breaking the market with 22,000 pounds in the 1850s. Within 20 years, this guy was producing 80,000 pounds in a year, and it was liquid honey. And this was at a time when everybody was producing and consuming comb honey. People did not trust liquid honey. They assumed that if you were selling liquid honey, it's because you were adulterating it with corn syrup or some other cheap sugars to try and rip them off. So Charles Vedant became a crusader, first of all, for extracted liquid honey, but also a crusader against adulteration of honey and other foods. He lobbied politicians. He played a part in getting the Pure Food Act passed by Congress in 1906 to crack down on adulteration and other industries. So he was a player. He got involved in things. He also was a big proponent of sweet clover. He planted sweet clover all around that tri-state area there, Hamilton, Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri. And to this day, when I drive up there in the summertime, I see the yellow and white sweet clover growing along the roadsides, and I can't help but think that this stuff is descendant from some of the stuff that Charles was planting 150 years ago. And he also jumped into the beekeeping equipment in a big way and became not only were the Vedants the largest beekeeping operation in the country, but they were also the largest beekeeping supplier in the country and manufacturer. And also, when Langstroth was getting up in years and having health problems, more health problems, he always kind of had what he called head troubles, where I think it was kind of like depression, where he would go into a funk for a period of time and couldn't really do anything, and then jump out of it and be extremely productive. But this had gotten worse later in life, and when he felt it was time to publish a revision of The Hive and the Honeybee, he drove from Philadelphia to Hamilton, Illinois, and met Charles in person for the first time and asked him to take on this project. And so Charles Vedant published the first major revision of that book, and the Vedants have been publishing it ever since. I don't know how many editions they have to date. I know the last one was in 2015. But it's a big project. So if you ask me when I plan on retiring, it's as soon as they start talking about the next revision of this. As much as I'd love to have my name on there as editor, I don't think I want to go through that. And this is these guys using one of those old foundation machines at the time. Now it's done in a big long. It looks like a label press. I used to run label presses in the printing industry, and it kind of looks like that. It's got the big rollers, but it's actually there's a big chill roller that goes around and it chills the liquid wax, and it's sheared off, and then it runs through the impression cylinders, and it's formed out, and they add the wires that go through it, and they chop it off at the end and stack it. So it's a pretty neat process. So, talk about kind of the history of where the journal came from and where it has come. Wagner started this in 1861. He produced the very first issue. He pretty much wrote and compiled the whole thing. It was about 30 pages long, and then this thing went for 1 year and then went on hiatus because, of course, the other thing that happened in 1861 was the Civil War started, so it kind of threw a wrench in a lot of work. So this thing shut down after a year, started back up in '66. He moved it to Washington at that time. And unfortunately, Wagner, he had a weak heart, and he ended up dying of heart failure in 1872, and the future of the magazine was uncertain, and Langstroth again stepped in, worked with Samuel's son George to keep this thing afloat for a year or so until they could find a buyer. And this was W.F. Clark, who moved the thing to Chicago, merged it with the National Bee Journal, which was run by a woman called Ellen Tupper. And she's an interesting character in herself. She was born in Rhode Island. Her family bounced around the East Coast. Her father was a newspaper man, and as she grew up, she learned to write and started writing articles about the various things, and she was a good writer, and she married a young man who was a minister, and he was also he worked for sawmills, a wood industry. And Ellen had health problems, and her doctors told her advised her to move out west for the climate. They ended up moving out to Iowa, and they had a hard life. I mean, they were not successful. They bought a 400-acre farm, ended up having to gradually sell this thing off because they couldn't make any money. She had 11 children during her life, lost 6 of them. I mean, it was just a rough go for her. But at some point, she discovered beekeeping, and she took to it, and she was very good at it. She started teaching beekeeping, especially to other women, as a means of them being self-sufficient. When women would lose their husbands, they had no wherewithal to continue to do anything. So she really pushed this as a help to women, and she trained a lot of people. She started importing queens. She was rearing queens, selling queen bees, selling full hives of bees, and she really grew in a big way. She started this magazine in Iowa, and then ended up merging it with ABJ and becoming co-editor. And about 1877, her world kind of came down around her. She got stretched too thin. She was accused of forging checks. It turned out she'd been forging checks all over the place, and in the names of prominent people in the community, including the governor of Iowa. And these checks totaled as much as $20,000, that was real money back then. I mean, it's still a lot of money for some of us. It was for me before I got the editor's job. But anyway, she ended up going to trial, and she was acquitted on the basis of insanity, which that surprised me that happened back then already. But she ended up moving with one of her daughters out to the Dakotas, with her husband as well. He died a couple of years later. He was also in poor health. But she and her daughter kind of bounced around the West, and she was still writing articles for various magazines under a pen name. She ended up dying in, I think, '88, but just a very, very interesting and ultimately sad story. But she and her husband were prominent in political causes. They were big in anti-slavery movement, the women's suffrage movement, temperance movement. They wanted to, ban alcohol back then, and so she had a lot going on in her life. So anyway, you can see here where this magazine got sold 3 or 4 times, and Thomas Newman actually ran this thing as a weekly for a few years, which just stresses me out thinking about it. You know, today I was going all day, kind of putting that April puzzle together, deciding which articles are in, which ones we push forward, all this stuff. You know, what goes where, and tomorrow I go up to Hamilton in the morning to do put the finishing touches. I can't imagine doing that 4 times a month. It's just too much. So anyway, finally in 1912, George York is looking for a buyer, and along comes C.P. Dadant, Charles's son, says, we'll buy it. So the Dadants bought it, brought it to Hamilton, Illinois, where it resides till today. And by the way, I mentioned here, I forgot to mention up there, I've got Dadant and question mark up there. When they were desperate there to find a buyer after Wagner died, they actually approached Charles Dadant, and Charles turned them down because he said, I'm still, you know, he was doing some translations of some French into English and stuff, but he just wasn't comfortable enough with the English language to take on editing an English language news magazine. So he turned them down, and here we go, but 40 years later, it ends up with the Dadants after all. So then you can see here, he takes this over in 1912. C.C. Miller, I've got it there as associate editor. He was a big name in the industry at that time. He'd been writing a column for the journal, actually, called Questions and Answers, which was kind of the precursor to the classroom column that Jerry Hayes later wrote for years and years, and that Jamie Ellis writes today. He also, he had a book called 40 Years Among the Bees, which he followed 10 years later with 50 Years Among the Bees. Just a lot of good information about what he learned in all these years as a beekeeper. And you'll notice here I've got on several of these things, I've got et al, which means and others, like they do in the scientific publications. You know, they go John Smith et al, you know, and his group of scientists. So keep in mind that throughout all these years, the Dadant Company is a large-scale manufacturing and beekeeping operation. So you had all these things going on, and in this one I mentioned GHK was also the chief beekeeper. So you've got all these various people are working in the plant or out in the beehives, and then they're also writing a couple of articles for the journal, and they're working on putting this magazine together at the end of the month. So it was a group operation very much for a lot of these years. And all of that changed in '74. They actually went out and they hired a journalist. Joe Graham came in, and he kind of modernized the magazine and ultimately turned it into what it is today. Do you mind grabbing me a magazine?
So when are you retiring?
What's that?
2062.
Yeah, I was. I just wonder if anybody noticed that. If I hang around for 43 years like Joe did, that'll put me at 2062.
Wow.
The hive and the honeybee's just gonna have to wait. Thanks. So yeah, he modernized the magazine into what it is today. But I met Joe Graham in 2011. Actually met him and Kim Flodden both down at Galveston. Did you go down there? Galveston, they had the American Beekeeping Federation and the American Honey Producers. This was an organization that had split, I don't know when, 70s or something like that. They'd split apart, had some kind of a schism, and this was the first time they'd actually come back together and held a joint meeting down in Galveston. And it was a big deal, and I went down there. And I was fortunate, I met both of these editors at the time, and I had known them both via email and stuff. I did a Missouri newsletter from 06 through 16, and both of these, both of the magazines advertised in there, so they got the newsletter every other month when it came out, and they'd periodically pick up magazine or articles from me, which was a pretty cool thing. Actually, more so, Bee Culture published more than the Journal did. They've got lower standards over there. But anyway, it was pretty cool to meet both of these editors. And then I talked to Joe again in person a couple of years later when they had his 150th anniversary in 13. And they did tours of the plant and everything. When Joe was sitting there in the ABJ library, you know, during the tour, and I went back in there afterwards and I was chatting with him, and I said, "You've been here quite a while, haven't you?" And he said, "Yep, I got a journalism school. I answered an ad in the paper. I've been here ever since." Didn't know the first thing about bees or beekeeping when I got here. And it just floored me. And of course, he wasn't there long before he became a beekeeper, and I think they probably kind of nudged him and said, "Hey, you need to know a little bit about what you're writing about here." But it certainly didn't take him long to gain the respect from both of his writers and his readers. So he was there for 43 years, and I always kind of told myself, you know, and I kind of, you know, trade emails with these guys, and I always kind of thought, you know, both these guys are starting to get up near retirement age. One of these guys announces their retirement, assuming they advertise a job, I'm gonna put in an application, just see. I didn't feel like I had much of a chance, you know, but I thought I'm gonna try. Well, Joe's retirement got by me. They said they posted it. They told me later, yeah, we did post it in the Journal, but you know, who reads the ads in these things, right? Don't tell them. But anyway, I didn't see it. I sent Joe an email one day, and I got kind of an out of office type response saying, "I'm retired, talk to Kirsten Trainer." And I was like, "Dang it, how did that happen?" So anyway, about a year later, I ended up, it was just one of these things where things fall into place at the right time. I had an old date-ant smoker that I had for about 15 years, probably would have lasted another 15 years, but I backed over it in the driveway one day, flattened it, ran to the farm store, picked up some cheap Chinese knockoff, hated it, and so a couple months later, the Missouri State Beekeepers had their fall conference. This was October of 17. I went to that conference. First break, I marched straight back to the date-ant booth to buy a smoker. Well, Gabe date-ant was sitting there, and I hadn't seen him in a couple of years because he had taken over operations and wasn't really attending conferences. But I bought a smoker, had a chat with him, asked him, you know, hey, you know, mentioned the editor thing. And I said, you know, I wish I had known that job was coming open because I just kind of thought I'd put in for it. He looked at me, he said, "I wish I'd known you were interested." Well, your name actually came up, which, you know, really kind of, I was kind of taken aback by that. But 2 weeks later, I wake up on a Monday morning, and I check my email before going to work, and I got a message from Gabe saying, "Hey, our editor just stepped down over the weekend. When can you come see us?" I had actually had the next day scheduled off work to run some errands, and I turned to Diane and I said, "I got a new errand for tomorrow." So I drove up there and I talked with Gabe and his dad, Nick Date-ant, who's 5th generation, and his cousin Matt Ross. We talked for about an hour and a half about this and that, and Matt and Gabe took me to lunch, and I'm sitting there eating a cheeseburger, and we're discussing things, and I started saying something like, "Yeah, if I were to get this job," and Gabe cut me off. He said, "The job's yours if you want it. But go home, think it over, talk to your wife, do me a favor, get back to me about tomorrow so we know what's going on." So I went home, made a big show about, you know, thinking it over. Traded emails with him about benefits, and the next day I called him back and said, "Hell yeah, I'm taking the job." American Bee Journal, for God's sake, you know. So that was just the coolest thing in the world, and I still pinch myself that I'm actually here, and they still like me. So. Probably not that long, but we'll see. So anyway, gonna kind of run through what the look of these journals as we go. This is that original year. This is actually April of '61, but it's 30 pages, pretty plain thing, you know, kind of newsprint type material. These are, you know, some of the contributors here. This was when it was running as a weekly in the 1880s. And it's still, you know, very, very plain, you know, less expensive materials like a lot of things were back then. This was C.P. Day's first edition. You can see the old modern logo up there. So they started this. He took over at the time when they were building the big hydroelectric dam between Keokuk and Hamilton, which I still see up there all the time, and now it's got a big Amaranth sign on it, it's still operational. But you can see C.C. Miller was working there, associate editor. This is in the 1840s. My dad gave me a stack of old magazines at one point, some ABJs and some Gleanings magazines. I thought this was cool because this particular year, every month they featured a woman who was prominent somewhere in the industry, and this was one from Missouri, so I put it up here. And you can see all the various editors that were involved. Frank Pellet, he wrote a very definitive history of beekeeping at one point. He also wrote a book on beekeeping plants, and so there was a lot of history there. And you can see now we've got two colors. We're coming up in the world. You know, printing technology is advancing and getting a little more affordable. This was Joe's first issue. That was not his logo. That was changed in the 60s. That to me looks like it should say American Airlines. Yeah. I don't know what they were thinking back then, but he changed it back to the other one back in about a year or so later. But we've also got we got the two color thing here. It was still all manual paste up, which meant you're literally pasting things on boards. You have it came up with typesetting machines at one point where you type out a column of text. You'd run it through this waxing machine. You put wax on the back and you paste it onto this board. And there's a little bit crooked, you know. And you put all the photos and the ads and everything. Then you'd haul all these boards to the printer, and they would image them with a process camera and turn them into plates and print them. And then, of course, anything shifts in the truck on the way over, you know, then you got an ad that's crooked or something falls off, you know, that's just the way it was done back then. It's a long time ago. Now everything's digital.
It wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, you know, it wasn't. I mean, I lived through, I went to print
1984?
back in the day. What's that?
1984? No, I don't know.
So in 1991, they came out with 4-color process, where you could have full color images, where they were putting the front cover and the inside cover advertising. If you wanted to pay that extra money for that color ad, you could have that. And again, there's the technology is improving. And for just a quick explanation of how this was done was, you take a full color image and you shoot it through you image it through a series of filters, and it splits that into 4 colors. Light, the color of light is red, green, blue, RGB. It's what your TV screen is based on, and those filters convert it to their opposite colors: cyan, magenta,
Yellow.
and
black.
Cyan, magenta, yellow. And then you add black to that, and you have 4-color process. So you end up with 4 plates full of dots that then marry together into this full color image again. And you can take this and you look at it under an 8x magnifier, and you can see that it's all just made up of dots. It's a really cool thing. The principle has been around for centuries, just the technology finally caught up with it where people are actually able to do it. And 10 years later, it became more affordable and able to do it full color throughout the magazine. Both of the beekeeping magazines made these changes about the same time. So it's a pretty neat thing. So this was my first issue in February of 19. I actually started the Monday after Thanksgiving in 18, and I went up there and worked for a week with Joe Graham. They pulled him out of retirement to finish up the January issue because the previous editor had left kind of in the middle of things. And it was funny, Joe called me a few days ahead of time and said, "Hey, congratulations on the job." And then he said, "You know, when I decided to retire, you were the first person I thought of." He said, "I thought, we thought you weren't interested." I guess because I didn't answer the ad. I don't know. But I was just, first of all, I was just shocked, to hear that. But I was also thinking, would it have killed somebody to give me a call? Anyway, it all worked out. So I went up there and I worked with him, at the end of the month when they were finishing up this January issue. So the morning we're gonna submit the proofs to the printer, or the morning on the day before the proofs are going to the printer, Susan, our graphic artist, printed the whole thing out, brought this stack of papers, plunked them on Joe's desk, said, here's the issue for you to go through one last time. And I flipped open the top couple of pages and I saw editor Eugene Makovec, and I'm like, wait a minute, what's with this? And he said, well, we didn't want to go back to my name and then go to yours, so we just put your name on it. So I said, Susan, can you print me out a stack of these? So I took it home I took it back to the hotel that night with a red pen and marked up a few little things. Said, hey, there's a new editor in town.
You actually edited it.
Yeah, so I made a few minor little things, but that's the way it started. By the way, this picture, I had this picture on one of my Missouri newsletters. I'd taken this shot of old beehives stacked in winter that were covered with snow, and got some compliments on it. So Kirsten Trainer had put out, somebody forwarded me something a year prior where she had posted something on Facebook looking for a winter photo for her January issue, and so I pulled that out and I sent it to her complete with the caption that I had used, and I got kind of a form letter response back saying, yeah, thanks for the photo, it doesn't really meet our needs at this time. I said, okay, it's fine. So a year later, little did I know I'd be in the need of a winter photo, so I pulled that out and said, you know what, it meets my needs. It's just a matter of taste. And I've had better numbers, but I just wanted to use my own cover of that. So another change that was made, not by me, but by Joe, was the gloss. This is called the UV coating, this hard gloss. It's a protective coating and also just gives the images that pop, that makes the magazine look nice. And of course we've kept that original, not original, but the original good masthead, that logo. It's not, and that's not really a font. It was something somebody had drawn at some point, because you can't. There's been a couple times where I wanted to, make a line of text using that font, so you kind of have to draw it by letter. So one of the things that the questions that I had early on when I took up beekeeping was, what's the difference between these two magazines? Because my dad had these around, here and there, but I never really had an interest in beekeeping when I was growing up. Never really talked to him about that kind of thing much. But when I first joined Eastern Missouri Beekeepers back in '96, the form that they gave you, the membership form, it had a series of check boxes. They had a checkbox for EMBA membership. They had one for the Missouri State Beekeepers. They had check boxes for bee culture, American Bee Journal, There was another one called the Speedy Bee at the time. That was kind of a cheaper, I think it was a quarterly thing that didn't last much longer after that. But you had all these things, and you would pay the treasurer your money for everything that you checked on there, and then he or she would forward that money eventually to the various things. You know, they collect it and send, 20 subscriptions to this magazine and whatnot. So I was asking the question, what's the difference between these two magazines? And didn't really get a clear answer as to which one was better, but the consensus was kind of that, well, the American Bee Journal is more for commercial beekeepers, it's more scientific and in-depth, whereas Bee Culture is more for hobbyists and beginners, and there was something to that. They have come closer over the years, but there is something to that thing. But you got to keep in mind that we're a very small industry for producing a national magazine. So you've really, if you're going to stay afloat, you've got to appeal to all segments of that industry. That 5% or so that are the large commercial beekeepers, the probably 75% that are hobbyist beekeepers with 25 or fewer hives, and then you've got that growing segment of sideliners in between. And you've got to appeal to all those people really to keep yourselves afloat. So here's a quick question. I know there's not that many people here, but how many people get American Bee Journal? How many get Bee Culture? So who gets both? So that's what I want to see is the guy that gets both, because and I tell people this all the time. They're both good magazines. They have different writers for the most part. There are some that go back and forth. They cover some different topics, or they cover the same topics in different ways. And there are differences, of course, but they're both well worth the money. And if you think about it, if you get both of these magazines, we're talking $60-some a year. If you produce one more super of honey, or bring one more county through winter based on the information that you brought home from these magazines, you're way ahead of the game. So here are some differences, and of course, I've gotten both of these magazines for 26, 27 years. I did decide before too long which one was my favorite. I probably don't have to give you a big hint as to which one it was, but the reason being, well, and I credit Joe Graham in large part for this. The reason being it's just more, the ABJ has just been more professionally done over the years. And with my varied background in photography, printing, writing, graphic design, I just appreciate going through this magazine and just seeing the more professional layouts, the better copy editing, and just the better quality materials and everything. So that's what it was for me. But that's not everybody. But here are some of the differences as I see it, both from my perspective before and now as editor. We are still a little bit more scientific to some degree. We tend to write more in-depth articles. Just to illustrate, we average about 116 pages a month. It varies. Bee Culture is a solid 100 pages every month, and we're counting the cover as part of that. They probably have 2 or 3 more articles in those 100 pages than we have in our 116. They average shorter 1 to 2 page articles. We tend to go 3 to 4, probably on average. So, and it varies. We have shorter and longer ones, but so we just tend to be a little bit more in depth. They're ahead of us in their digital presence. They've got more of a more active website. They've got other things going on. We both have a digital version of the magazine. They push theirs a little bit more than we do. They've got this thing called Catch the Buzz that you get on this mailing list, and they send you something every day. We have a similar one called ABJ Extra, but it's more of a every week or two thing. The difference is Catch the Buzz is ad-based. So for their advertisers, they have to drop something in your mailbox every day. So I only send something out if it's something that I feel would be interesting to me, and it's something that either is something that can't wait until the next print issue, or it's going in the next print issue, but I want to get the information out ahead of time too. So that's kind of the difference, and Bee Culture just has more of a folksy attitude, more of a kind of a Mother Earth news feel to it sometimes. And at least it was under Kim, maybe a little bit less so under Jerry Hayes. But that's really the difference between the two. And then we also accept photos, cover photos from people. If you got some special photo that you've taken, feel free to send it to me. We pay $100 for the cover if we publish it. And we do a calendar. The last couple of years, we came out with a print calendar that it's a calendar that's it's a good quality calendar that we sell, and I take photos for that too. So both of them are 9 by 12. Just one's vertical, one's horizontal. And what was I gonna say? We have a new combo subscription as well, where we get asked questions every now and then and said, hey, I get the more expensive print subscription, but I'm on vacation or I lost the magazine. Why can't I go online and view the digital version without a special subscription? So we came out with a combo subscription, and actually Bee Culture beat us to the punch on this too, and this was not my fault. I was pushing these guys for 2 years prior to come out with a combo subscription, and then along comes Bee Culture with this combo subscription. I'm like, see, they can do it. And what it was really is it's a matter of logistics, because there's a lot that's got to go on behind the scenes. They come in on separate lists. There are subscriptions that come in, say, through Amazon versus some other services that sell magazines, and all that stuff has got to be melded together. So it's a huge pain in the neck, and it's stuff that I try not to get myself involved in because I have enough to do. But that's just the way it is. So I think that's all I've got. Does anybody have any questions about anything? Anybody think Bee Culture is about it?
The very first picture of the cover of the very earliest journal looked a whole lot, had the look of an almanac. Was that kind of its format?
I don't think so. I know it wasn't, because they had a, when they did the 150th anniversary, they reprinted the very first issue. What? You were oh, this is the one that was. This is the same issue on the other side. This is actually the April one, but it had. You go inside and it's just columns of text and headings and things like that. Yeah, but that's just the way the journal was laid out, and you know they're kind of similar to other magazines at the time. You know, as they go, there's a lot of the magazine, the newspaper layout like that. But they were pretty basic stuff and mostly text. If they had images, they were line drawings, and then later on black and white photos that were not the greatest quality usually, but things have definitely leaped forward technology-wise. Okay. We beat 8:30.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So you probably all saw that there are some issues if you want to grab an issue, and there are some subscription forms if you want to go old school and sign up for the magazine. Of course, you can do it online.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot to mention that. Yeah, we do have a club discount. So if you call in a subscription to the office, tell them you belong to St. Louis Beekeepers, ask them for the club discount. It's about 10 or 11% now.